This episode is a trackpads.com production.
In the darkness before dawn, on the 20th of November, 1917, one of the most important changes in modern warfare was waiting in silence. For years, Western Front offensives had usually announced themselves with days of bombardment, a grim overture that warned the defender, tore up the ground, and often ruined the attacker's own hopes of movement before the infantry even started forward. At Cambrai, the British tried something different. The guns would not stay silent forever, but they would remain silent long enough to make surprise possible. And that choice represented a major intellectual break with the habits of earlier battles. The artillery revolution at Cambrai was not simply about firing more shells. It was about using guns with more precision, more confidence, and more imagination, so that artillery became the hidden hand behind a combined arms blow instead of merely the loudest part of the battlefield. This podcast is accompanied by a companion book that expands the story of the Battle of Cambrai, with additional historical context, maps, and dozens of enhanced colorized photographs from the battle. Your purchase helps support our mission to keep these podcasts free. You can find the book at militaryauthor.me or at trackpads.com. To understand why this mattered, it helps to remember what the old system usually produced. A long registration bombardment was meant to solve many problems at once. It was supposed to cut wire, smash trenches, suppress enemy guns, and prepare the way for infantry. Yet in practice, it often created a cruel contradiction. The longer the bombardment lasted, the more certain the enemy became that an attack was coming, and the more time he had to bring up reserves, prepare machine guns, and shelter his troops in dugouts until the barrage lifted. Meanwhile, the shelling churned roads, fields, and trench lines into craters, making it harder for the attacker to move guns forward, keep units together, and exploit any initial gain. In battle after battle, the artillery did great violence to the landscape, but not enough decisive damage to the defensive system as a whole. Predicted fire was an attempt to escape that trap. In plain language, it meant that gunners aimed and timed their fire through calculation rather than by the older routine of repeated ranging shots. To do that, they had to know far more than the rough direction of the target. They needed accurate maps, carefully surveyed gun positions, reliable data on distance and bearing, and allowance for things that sound dry but mattered enormously, such as barrel wear, propellant performance, weather, and the subtle differences between one battery and another. The goal was simple to say and difficult to achieve. When the guns opened, the first effective rounds had to land where they were intended without the usual public rehearsal. That was the great promise of predicted fire. It turned artillery from a noisy process of adjustment into a more disciplined act of prearranged violence. This was not magic, and it did not emerge overnight. British artillery had been learning hard lessons since the opening campaigns of the war, and by 1917 those lessons were beginning to combine into something more mature. Surveying improved, mapping improved, staff work improved. Officers and specialists became better at locating enemy batteries through methods such as sound ranging, which used the time and direction of gun reports to estimate where hostile artillery was firing from, and flash spotting, which relied on observers identifying muzzle flashes and plotting them with care. Aircraft also contributed by observing the battlefield from above and helping build a clearer picture of German positions. None of this sounded dramatic in the way tanks did, but together these methods gave British gunners a new confidence that they could strike accurately without first broadcasting their intentions to the enemy. Henry Hugh Tudor became one of the key figures in bringing these ideas into the Cambrai plan. He understood that artillery did not have to behave as it had behaved at the Somme or in the mud of Flanders. If the guns could fire effectively from the map, then a battle might begin with shock instead of warning. That was an exciting possibility on its own, but it became even more powerful when linked to the other ideas developing at the same time. Tanks could deal with wire and help cross trenches. Infantry could move in closer cooperation with armor and barrage schedules. Engineers could support crossings and routes. The result was not an artillery plan floating alone in space. It was a new relationship between artillery and the rest of the attack, one in which surprise was no longer surrendered at the very start. The guns were silent before the attack, not because artillery had become less important, but because it had become more important. In earlier battles, commanders often relied on sheer duration, as if time and volume could solve problems that method had not yet solved. At Cambrai, the British were trying to hold their fire until the last possible moment, because they wanted every advantage of timing. If the Germans did not receive days of warning, then tanks might reach the wire before defenders fully understood what was happening. Infantry might cross the first killing zones before machine gun crews had properly reorganized. Counter-battery fire might strike German guns before those batteries could break up the assault. Silence, in this case, was not passivity. It was preparation for a different kind of opening blow. The idea also worked because artillery no longer had to do every job in the old way. At Cambrai, some of the burden of clearing obstacles shifted toward tanks and toward more effective shell technology. Sensitive fuses made high explosive more useful against surface targets such as wire, while tanks themselves could crush lanes through entanglements that previously required prolonged shelling. This mattered for more than convenience. It meant the British did not need to spend days smashing the front line simply to create passage for their infantry. They could preserve the ground from becoming a crater field and still expect routes through the obstacle belt. In armored warfare history, that is a major conceptual change. Tanks and artillery were not competing with each other. They were relieving each other of certain tasks so that the combined assault could move faster and with more coherence. When the attack finally began, the silence ended all at once. At 6:20 in the morning, on a front of several miles, the British artillery opened without the customary preliminary bombardment, and the effect was as much psychological as physical. The defenders had not been allowed the familiar warning period in which to brace themselves, strengthen vulnerable points, and infer exactly where the main attack would land. At the same moment, tanks and infantry began to move. The artillery's tasks were multiple. Some batteries laid planned barrages to suppress the forward defenses. Others concentrated on enemy guns in counter-battery work, trying to disrupt the artillery that posed the greatest danger to the assault. Smoke also played a role in shielding parts of the advance. The important point is that the artillery was no longer just opening the battle. It was shaping its first critical hours in support of a wider operational design. This is also why it would be wrong to imagine Cambrai as a battle where artillery suddenly became quiet or secondary. In one sense, Cambrai was a triumph of artillery precisely because the guns did so much without indulging in the old theatrical preliminaries. A great many guns were involved, and the fire plan was carefully organized. The difference lay in timing, purpose, and method. The artillery did not simply hammer the German line for days and hope enough damage accumulated. It entered the battle like an instrument already tuned, striking at the opening moment with a plan built around surprise. That distinction is central to understanding modern firepower. The most effective artillery is not always the artillery that shouts longest. Sometimes it is the artillery that arrives most intelligently, at the exact moment when enemy confusion and friendly movement can reinforce one another. The first day at Cambrai showed how powerful that could be. British forces broke through major parts of the Hindenburg Line with a speed that stood out sharply against the usual tempo of trench warfare. Tanks crushed wire and crossed trenches. Infantry followed through lanes opened in the defenses. The artillery had helped make that possible, not only by striking forward positions, but by limiting the warning available to the Germans, and by trying to suppress hostile batteries before they could dominate the battlefield. For a time, the whole operation seemed to vindicate the new thinking. Surprise had not solved every problem, but it had restored movement to a battlefield system that usually strangled movement at birth. In that sense, the artillery revolution at Cambrai was not merely technical, it was operational, because it gave the British a way to begin fast rather than begin exhausted. Yet this revolution had limits, and Cambrai revealed those too. Predicted fire did not make friction disappear. Not every German gun was silenced. Not every strong point was neutralized. Once the attack moved beyond its first planned bounds, the old problems of control, communication, obstacles, and exploitation came back into view. Guns still had to be moved forward. Ammunition still had to be supplied, and success still had to be turned into sustained pressure before the enemy recovered. In places where resistance stiffened or where crossings failed, the artillery's opening brilliance could not by itself rescue the wider operation. That is an important lesson. A fire plan can create opportunity, but it cannot guarantee that every other arm will be able to enlarge that opportunity before the battlefield changes again. Even so, Cambrai deserves its place in military history because it showed that artillery had crossed a threshold. The gun was no longer merely the engine of attrition. It was becoming an instrument of surprise and orchestration inside a larger all-arms attack. Later campaigns in 1918 would refine these methods further, and later mechanized warfare would continue to depend on the same principle. Mobility survives only when firepower is planned in a way that supports movement instead of destroying the conditions movement needs. In that long story, Cambrai stands as an early proof that mathematics, survey work, observation, and disciplined planning could make artillery more dangerous by making it less predictable. The loudest idea at Cambrai was not heard before dawn. It was understood afterward, when armies realized that silence itself could be part of the fire plan. The silence before the attack was the outward sign of an inward change, a decision to trust calculation, preparation, and coordination more than habit. When the guns finally spoke, they did so in support of a broader method that linked artillery to tanks, infantry, engineers, and timing with unusual sophistication for the period. Cambrai did not perfect that method, and the battle's later frustrations remind us how incomplete the system still was. But the opening attack proved that artillery could do something more than warn, devastate, and wait. It could help create surprise, preserve momentum, and open the door to a new kind of warfare. Background references consulted for historical grounding include the official British dispatch on Cambrai, and later analyses of the predicted fire barrage, counter-battery work, survey methods, and the battle's opening surprise.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.